The first thing that's important to know, especially if you're sort of new to the hobby, is understanding a little bit about sort of dice probability and how that works. So I think the easiest thing to do is let's just jump it over here real quick so we can take a look at it. So if you are familiar with the latest and greatest in role-playing games, you will be very familiar with the d20 roll. 20 sides. Each side there's a 5% chance it will happen. Now, you may also notice things like, let's say, the good old Great Axe. The D12 that only barbarians seem to use most of the time. So D12, 12 sides, each side is weighted equally with 8.3 repeating chance of equal numbers are going to show up there. Now, there's also another weapon that has a maximum of 12 that you might come across, the ball. And instead of rolling 1d12, it rolls 2d6. So the difference in that roll is that 2d6, and anytime you have multiples of dice together, you get a more what they call bell curve or normal distribution, which means that the results are going to skew towards the middle number. So instead of everything being weighted with that 8.3 repeating percent, you have about a 1 1/3 chance to come up with a 7 on 2d6. And then for every step away from 7 you get, a little less likely until you get down to your 2s on one side and your 12s on the other side, which don't come up that often. As you can see right here, I rolled 11, so we're way above the curve. But it's useful to know those two things when you're trying to figure out, and you want to know the likelihood of something. And let's say, oh, I think they're going to do something, but I don't think that there's an equal chance, yes or no, that it's going to happen. So you might do something like, okay, I'm going to roll 2d6 instead of like the d20 high, it happens. You'd be like, okay, I'm going to roll 2d6. If it's anything on the outliers, so like a 2, 3, an 11, or 12, then the answer will be no, and the rest will be yes. That's a 6, so that's a yes for us. So it's helpful to kind of understand those distributions, and it is helpful to start to gauge about how much damage something does. In 2024, they also made the distinction now where now they give you sort of like the average damage number on most attacks, but they still don't do that for spells for some reason. The spells would work the same way, so if you're like, hey, it does 3d6 damage, that's 10.5, 0.5 per, so it's 3.5 to 7 to 10.5 with 3d6. And just knowing that is going to give you a little helpful when you're trying to gauge about like what an average damage output will be on either side. So you know if you have, again, we said a barbarian, you know the barbarian, you know they're going to probably rage during combat, you know they've got an 18 to their strength, you know that they're going to do 4 for their ability modifier plus, let's say, 2 for their raging, because that's what level they are, so plus 6, and they're going to do this 2d6 roll, so you know most of the time they're going to deal about 7 plus the 6, so about 13 points of damage per attack when they're raging, which can be helpful when you're trying to calculate how many hit points, maybe like a big set piece battle, how much hit points you want to give that boss. You might think about, okay, they're going to do about this much per turn, about that much per turn. In general, the party should do per turn about this much damage based off of their probability to hit and whatever the AC and saves are of the monster. I can kind of tweak those numbers a little bit and then be like, well, I want it to last for about 3 rounds, so okay, and it should have about this many hit points. And that can give you a good idea, because a lot of tinkering can happen where the monster NPCs both have kind of some bloated hit point totals. So if you can shave those hit point totals, the next important kind of weird little trick to know as a dungeon master is the Pareto principle, which is, you probably maybe have heard of it as the 80-20 rule. And it's just sort of a weird thing that comes up. The actual Pareto principle is that 20% of your input equals 80% of your output. So if I have 2 hours to prep a game, so that's 120 minutes. So I know that about 24 minutes of my prep is really going to cover about 80% of everything. That's me probably going and grabbing a map, throwing together a few encounters for what's going to be in those rooms, and I can figure that out. And then most of the other stuff is like coming up with the adventure. It's like, okay, who's sending us on this adventure? What's the reward? What's the like MacGuffin? What are we actually trying to do in this adventure? Like all that stuff, sort of that long tail, where sort of that first part is the most important part because that's the part that you're going to engage with. But just 20 and 80 in general is a good number to play around with, especially when it comes to percentages. So like I was saying, is I was going to take this big bad BBEG for this set piece battle. And I'm like, oh, well, it's a solo monster. It's got a bunch of hit points. If I just immediately just cut off 20% of that, like knock it down to 80%, it's probably going to be a quicker fight. That might take a full 1 round of combat out, and then it still gives us some leeway if somebody hits us with some crits or some big spells that we still feel like we should probably be able to sneak in through those 3 big rounds of combat that we're really trying to hit. Another good one is roll twice and combine. I've talked about this a lot in tables, which is something that I started doing naturally a long time ago, but I realized that a lot of people don't actually say that out loud to new dungeon masters. It's like, hey, get you a lot more and a lot more interesting results by rolling twice on it and then trying to combine those answers together. A table of 20 results have hundreds now. Even if you get duplicates, 2 years down the road when you're using that table again, you'll probably come up with something completely different as the output for it. I have the ICRPG book in front of me. Let me find a table in here. Here's the Bizarre Loot table. It's a D100 table. I should have chosen a smaller table. That's alright. 13 and 87. So 13, if I wanted to put these together. A gag plank. Item, a plank of wood for building, but made hollow to effortlessly break under little force. Okay, so like a gag fighting stick. Gotcha. So that was 13. Beard birds. Item, a small family of birds that live in the nearest beard, but move to follow you. So if I wanted to combine those together, I'd probably be like, as you're inspecting the room, you realize that there is a false plank in the floor, and you're able to break through it, and you find underneath the floor there's a humanoid corpse that's sort of like desiccated and dried out, and there is a family of ground birds nesting in that beard. So as you pull the plank off, they kind of jump up and they start cheeping around and following you around. You have now inherited 1d4 baby birds that now trail you and try to live in the nearest beard. So whoever's got the beard in your party is who it's going to jump to, or seems most capable of growing a beard if nobody has beards, I guess. So roll twice, combine the tables, throwing stuff together. It works really well. Kind of talked about it earlier, is I like to use a little high-low method. Lots of streaming DMs, I feel like, do this. I think Brennan does this quite often. It's sometimes referred to as a luck roll or something like that. If I think of something as Dungeon Master and I think it might impact them or impact what decision they make, or they might know about something, I'll be like, hey, something is going to happen this turn, and I need to figure out whether something's going to target you or not. Right? I need you to choose high or low. They tell me, I roll the die. It doesn't have to be a d20. If they chose low in this instance, then whatever's most beneficial to them happens. So if I was targeting people for an attack, that person's not going to get targeted. We're gonna attack somebody else. But if they had guessed high, then they get the detrimental effect. So it's just kind of a luck die, and you can do it with any die because anything can roll high or low. And even though I say high or low, I might go high or low, but it really there's still an unlikely chance this will happen. They choose high, and I'm like, all right, well, on a 19 or 20, if I roll a 19 or 20, it happens. Well, I couldn't have scripted that. Natural 20. So it happens. Great boon for you. A lot of fun to play around with. Another one that's really fun, and we're gonna talk about connecting it a little bit with one of the other ones, but is the power law. So power law it's a thing that happens kind of in nature, and I first came across it with studies of, I think, population centers, where you basically have 1 and then 50%. It's very useful for modeling a deprecation of something. If you're like, okay, well, let's say you guys are going to a village that's been in trouble for some time. Let's say they've been accustomed to these troubles for 2 years. So you go, okay, so at the beginning, their population was, let's say, it had 1,000 people in it. It was a bustling, thriving village. It has 1,000 people. Trouble showed up after that first year. Half the people had either died or moved away. 500 people left in that. And then after that, the next one is, instead of doing half again, you do 1/3 of the total. So now there's 333 people here after the second year. So it does kind of give you that more sort of like logarithmic kind of curve. Can be a hard thing to model with head math, so the power law works really well from that. One thing, 1 divided by 2, 1 divided by 3, 1 divided by 4, 1 divided by 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You can keep going on and on and on. It's just one of these sort of like little tricks, DM tricks, that you kind of come up with, and you can do that sort of quick math. Piggybacking off of that, another sort of like weird, fun dice trick you can do. But I want to talk about pyramids. Pyramids are fun to play with. So there's D6 pyramids and D10 pyramids. They do the same. So if you've ever been, bowling, you're going to be familiar with a 10-point pyramid. because that's how bowling pins are lined up. So you have 1 at the top, then 2, then 3, then 4. So this is when you want sort of like a steepled odds for something. And you do the same thing for D6. So it's 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 across the bottom. So let's say you're coming into a new town and we have to come up with an NPC that you stopped on the street to ask. And I'd be like, I don't know what sort of like social class this person is. They could be low class, middle class, upper class. And I'm like, okay, I rolled a 1, so you managed to stop a very sort of like important noble person in the city. And now this is going to frame your conversation with them depending on what you're asking and how you look and whether people know who you are or don't. If you are a bunch of fully armed adventurers and you're walking down the street and then you turn to interrupt a noble crossing their path, they might think that you're trying to rob them because you're heavily armed and armored. And 5 of you just like stepped in front of them while they're walking down the street. So they might freak out and run the other direction. They might have guards that step in front of them. It might put you off if you don't have anybody in your party who's also a noble or high-ranking social strata to be able to have that conversation. There's a lot of stuff you can do with like the little pyramid things. So if you might go, they're running through this abandoned city. I'm going to say that it's most likely that they're going to come across, say, undead. And then what's something else they might run into? They might run into like scavenging bandit thieves. But I think that's going to be really rare. Maybe it's more likely that they run across some other sort of monstrosity that's living in here. So you're like, okay, we'll do the D6 again. Be like, okay, so if I roll just a 6 at the very, very top, that's going to be the bandits. That if I roll the 4 or 5, that's going to be maybe like a corpse collector or something like that. We'll make it a construct. That's if I roll a 4 or 5, and then if I roll a 1 through 3, it's just undead. And I know that, and I can do that in my head really quick. This random encounter you ran across was undead, so it's more undead. So it's a very easy way when you don't want, you don't need things to be equal, and you want sort of like a stacked scale up. So a D6 will give you 3 choices, 1, 2, 3, and then if you want that 4th choice, D10. And sometimes, like in my magic item tables that are in my DM binder, I use that D10 pyramid step, but I just broke it out for a D20 because everything else is in that table is a D20. So I was like, well, I'm just going to convert the D10 to a D20 by just doubling all the results. So that way I don't have to pull out one other random die when I'm going for a random table. Everything else in that table set is a D20. So trying to keep everything all together. And then, of course, the last thing that I would say is sort of like a dice trick is to use a GM Oracle. If you have seen any of the solo game stuff done, you've seen my GM Oracle and how I use it. But it is super useful for when you're running games and, you know, people ask you stuff that you didn't prep or wasn't expecting, and you just kind of draw a blank. Say you're going through a house. Does this room have a dumb waiter in it? I don't know, probably not. So I thought that was going to be a -3 to it, by thinking it was probably not, but I still rolled 11 or higher, even with the -3, so yeah, there's a dumb waiter in this room. You catch that. That probably goes upstairs someplace. They might have asked, you know, are there stalagmites in this cave? I don't know. Maybe. No. Apparently not. Apparently there's not a lot of condensation and dripping, so not a lot of stalagmites have formed, so there's no difficult terrain on the ground. You guys can move anywhere within the cave without any issue. It's very helpful for just answering questions, either that players ask you at the table or that you just need to answer for yourself. Or you're like, ooh, I don't know, is the big bad guy also had to do this thing? Is he still here? I don't know. I'll just roll a die. Okay, yeah, he's still here. Okay, so he was supposed to leave, but he hasn't left yet. Okay. Something like that. And anytime that anything's kind of in flux and you don't want to, especially in a situation where you think like you might be leaning towards one option. I mean, you can always just choose the option. You can lean into whatever you want. But if you're like, I want it to be more fair, like I think it's a random chance whether this thing happens or not, then you can use the GM Oracle die. But that's it. I just wanted to jump in, kind of record this. Super easy. Things that I find useful that I've sort of built over the years. There are things that I don't really see a lot of other sort of people talk about as far as in the DM, GM sphere, advice, whatever you want to call this kind of content. But that's it. Thanks for hanging out. I'll get you next time. Alright? Bye.